because I'm like afraid that I actually didn't record it and I don't want to see that. So, so we're up. This is our second to last session. Next week will be our last session. And I'm very excited because as I revisited the material that we're doing tonight, I sort of remembered how much I truly love this part of our text. It's the 5 Megillot, the 5 scrolls that we'll talk about. So let me go ahead and share my screen right there. And hopefully everyone can see that all right. There, and I can see all of you. There we go. Okay, we're already almost at the end. I'm sorry, in today's newsletter, the write-up of tonight's session was filled with errors, and I'm wondering, did I send it that way? Like, I'm a little embarrassed, but regardless. And we're in, of course, the Tanakh, and we're in the 3rd section of Ketuvim. And tonight we're looking at this central section of what are called the Megillot. The unique name that all of these books of Ketuvim are found in individual scrolls in the original. I mean, today we have them in books, but they were in scrolls. The difference, of course, being that unlike the Torah, which has 2 poles called the Eitz Chaim, a normal scroll just has 1, and so you pull it out. They're much shorter books. The Torah is way too long to do that, and the Megillot though are separate for a variety of reasons. It turns out that they are the shortest books within Ketuvim, which is something that I didn't realize until just doing my preparation. And the word Megillah, as you can see, it doesn't mean scroll, it means revealed. And we talk about, the Ganze Megillah, the whole thing, right? We think of it as a story, but I love this piece. This was from it must have been like a doctoral dissertation or something by this woman at HUC. I think she might be a rabbi, and I happened to find a PDF of it. It's a wonderful, wonderful curricular piece on using art in studying the Megillot. And she talks about that each Megillah reveals a Jewish perspective on life, right? Each one gives us a slightly different perspective. And just as we talk often about all kinds of learners, the Megillot is like another pathway into learning about Jewish values. The Torah is full of laws. It's got some stories, but every book has its own character, and the Megillot are unique. They represent lots of genres. They're not unified by the genre. Esther and Ruth are story-like narratives. Shir HaShirim, I should have gone over the names. I use the English and Hebrew names interchangeably. I apologize. Shir HaShirim is the Song of Songs. And Eicha is it's called in English Lamentations. And we'll talk about, as we get to each book, we'll talk about the name and how it came about. But they're really written as poetry, flat out poetry. And Kohelet, or Ecclesiastes, is part of the collection of wisdom literature. So they're each, they don't have that in common. It's not like they're all the same genre. We look at them today as a unit. We say the Chamesh Megillot, the 5 Megillot, and actually often people will say the 5 Megillot and Jonah. Now, Jonah is in the books of the prophets, but H.L. Ginsberg, sometime early in the last century, I think, wrote a book about the 5 Megillot and Jonah, and that grouping stuck. And so many people continue to group Jonah with the Megillot, and it makes sense. It resembles the Megillot in many ways. It's relatively short, and each of the Megillot is assigned to a holiday, and Jonah as well. Of course, we read on Yom Kippur, so it's got that in common with them, that it's particular to a specific holiday. But it wasn't always the case that these were a unit. Originally, they were done in what was seen to be chronological order, very loosely, by the way, chronologically, but that Ruth was an older text, Esther was a more recent text. But over time, they were regrouped to put them all together. And this order is a very specific order. This order is the order in which we read the scroll in the calendar year. So Song of Songs, Shir HaShirim, we read on Passover. The book of Ruth, we just read on Shavuot this past week. Lamentations is Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which falls during the summer months. This year it's in July, often it's in August. Ecclesiastes or Kohelet is on Sukkot in the fall. And Esther, of course, the one we know we're the most familiar with is, of course, at Purim time. And then, of course, if you put Jonah in here, Jonah would come between Lamentations and Ecclesiastes because of the way Yom Kippur falls. So we'll begin. So the custom of reading the scrolls comes from a variety of sources in various periods. Like no one's really sure how this all evolved. Interestingly enough, only Esther has a bracha, a blessing, before you read the scroll, that there's a blessing to say it. And only Esther is supposed to be written on parchment. So for example, at a Megillah reading on Purim, it should be read from a scroll. Now at our synagogue, we do read from paper because no one has so far committed to really learning the scroll. It's like learning Torah, and it's a lot of it. But we're aware that it's not exactly a kosher reading. But the other books, when we read in the synagogue, can be read from a book. Except in Jerusalem, they're all on parchment because they have them. And in Jerusalem also, the other Megillot, it's not Echa, but the other Megillot also have a blessing or a bracha that precedes them. And they have unique melodies, the trope, the musical notes. Echa is an astoundingly plaintive, sad, minor key, beautiful, beautiful trope. I didn't actually think about preparing those for you. I do read Echa. And Esther has its own trope that's very distinctive. And the other three share a similar trope. They're not sure that this was always the case, but this does seem to be the case today. I took a course at JTS one summer with, I think it was Professor David Marcus, and probably he was emeritus at that point or retired. In the summer, we had a lot of adjunct professors and a lot of folks that were, tenured, but basically retired. And he was, from an educational standpoint, and I was getting a master's in education, it was the worst I'd ever seen. He followed none of what you would say is good teaching qualities, but he was fascinating, and most of us were very motivated to learn. So like none of that mattered. It didn't matter that he simply read to us from his notes. He told us exactly what he wanted to know. It didn't matter that he wasn't using any kind of modern discussion techniques. We just soaked it up. And he highlighted, he's a biblical critic, and he highlighted the literary devices used in these Megillot. Now, I'm not a student of literature. I mean, I think I've mentioned that to you. I was a math person. I took some literature, mostly modern British fiction, but a lot of it's lost on me. But when someone points it out, I find it to be very fascinating. So the first is the use of names and epithets or nicknames, or nicknames basically. He used to say these were the weapons of the author. The person who's writing this has the ability to build in all of these messages that you and I might not pick up unless a scholar points it out to us. I just recently there's a book, Midrash and Movies, that I'm plowing my way through. And she talks about a scene, I'm trying to remember the movie, and there's a horse that is like whinnying in the background. You wouldn't think it's a street scene. You wouldn't think anything of it. And she made this incredible connection between the status of a horse in the society and the status of the character and foreshadowing. I mean, I would never see it. But to the literary critic, it's all right there. So the names have meanings. It can foreshadow someone's life, something to come. It can tell you something about who they are. They're rhyming names that add color. But more than that, sometimes those folks will share the same fate, or often they're marginal characters. It's just sort of like throwaway characters. It's sort of cutesy to put in these rhyming names. A lot of repetition all throughout the Bible. Was it Rosenzweig, or I think Rosenzweig calls it Leitwort. And it's when you see a key word, a root word repeated over and over again in a sentence or a section, the author, according to the biblical scholars, is trying to draw your attention to something. There are word plays. There's definitely alliteration. It's sort of intriguing, again, when it's pointed out to you, how the sound of the words make a difference. And in fact, Everett Fox, who translated the Torah, there's several new translations out, And Everett, in his translation, wanted to keep the sound of the Hebrew, right? That's hard to do when you translate. We try to put it into pretty English. But he wanted things that, like, for example, in the creation story, the world is tohu vavohu. 2 rhyming words. We don't know what those words mean. We say it's a void or that there was nothingness. We don't know what it is. Well, I don't remember how exactly he translated it, but he came up with 2 English words that sort of rhymed, that gave you that same sort of feeling of who knows what was going on when the world began. There's lots of irony. A simple device used, and we'll see some of it in the scrolls today. And then there's intertextuality, which is such a hard word to use, especially when you're teaching teenagers. But intertextuality is when they use, in this book, they're very quietly referring to something that everyone should know from that book. Right, so they might give in the book of Ruth, there's a connection to Abraham that you could easily miss, but why is the connection there, and how does that inform us? It's almost like an inside joke, if you'll think, or an inside message to those that are educated. I had one teacher that said it's like invisible hyperlinks. Right, today when you read an article online from some places, there are hyperlinks everywhere. Right, that if you this, go over here, just click on the word. Well, he calls these invisible hyperlinks that the rabbis could see, that you and I no longer see unless it's pointed out to us. So we begin with, at the beginning of the Jewish year, which is not Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the Jewish year is actually Passover, which is always very confusing for people, and with Shir HaShirim, Song of Songs. And it is astounding to me when I read through it for the first time, like with everyone else, astounding that this is in our Bible. I no matter what they teach me, it is an erotic love poem. It is beautiful. But the fact that we were able to include this in the canon is really incredible. 8 chapters, this unnamed man and this unnamed young woman pursue each other back and forth through the fields and the valleys, and the imagery and the artwork that goes along with it is just astounding. And the Midrash says that it was King Solomon. And in fact, the first line says that it was written by King Solomon, but we know that it wasn't. Without question, the style is not of the right time period. And so, we have this information from long ago what the rabbis thought, but now we have more modern ways of assessing. It doesn't really matter who wrote it. It is a common question we'd like to know, but it doesn't really matter. So how did it come to be in our canon? Why? Well, it was clearly a matter of controversy. You can find in the Talmud arguments over it, right? So it wasn't like a shoo-in. But Rabbi Akiva, one of the greatest rabbis of the Talmud, he was he died around the destruction of the Second Temple. He was one of the 10 martyrs, 10 rabbis that were tortured to death by the Romans in public. We have documentation on this. And he appears to be the one that stood up and said, no, this is worthy of being in this canon of our Bible. And he said, while all of the sacred writings are holy, the Song of Songs is the holy of holies. So not only is it worthy of being in the canon, but he elevates it to the highest level. Now, why does he do that? Does anybody know how they argue away why it's in the canon? So what they say is that it's an allegory of the loving relationship between Israel and God. And we have a lot of that in our texts. In Hosea, Israel is seen, Israel is seen as the unfaithful wife, the harlot, right? We have a lot of that imagery. And we see it over and over again with these allegorical references and this idea that God and Israel, the people Israel, have a loving relationship. As sensual as the book, I don't know that it's that important, but that's what it has. Now, some of the quotes that you would know, I apologize if this is too small to see. Of course, the first line I just wanted to share with you, it says, Shir HaShirim Asher L'Shlomo. These are Solomon's songs, right? So that's what whoever penned this attributes it to Solomon. And of course, I think I've mentioned that we think of Solomon as of writing 3 works in the Bible. The first one would be this one in his youth. The second being Proverbs, which we read last time, and the third one is Kohelet, which we'll do a little bit later. Ani l'dodi v'dodi li. This is a line that's become very common in Jewish artwork, wedding gifts, on wedding bands, on bracelets and necklaces. And as we seek to modernize the Jewish wedding ceremony, the bride doesn't say a thing, right? The groom says one line in Hebrew, that's a very formulaic line, and that's it. There's no I do's, none of that. That's all from outside. But in a way to try to, make everything egalitarian, many women, when the man, if it's a man and woman getting married, when the man says this one formulaic line, the woman will respond with Ani l'dodi v'dodi li. I know that I had looked up a line. I didn't want to say that. I wound up not saying anything, but that's another story. My daughter found a line that meant something to her. And of course, today when we have sometimes two men marrying or two women, that they look also for quotes that work for them. But without question, Ani l'dodi, I am my beloved and my beloved is mine, is a very common one. But also a related verse, similar words, just slightly differently arranged, is a very beautiful Israeli folk song, several different versions of it. Some of you may be familiar with it. The older tune that I know is Dodi liva ani lo haroeh bashoshanim. And there's a more modern tune, Dodi liva ani lo haroeh. And they're beautiful, beautiful tunes, and they have Israeli folk dances that go with them. And then this line, which I really don't know that well, but it's let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. And I don't know, is it Tom Jones or whoever it is that wrote that song? Your kisses are sweeter than wine, right? That's from this. It's influenced from this. This is known literature. It's used by the poets and the artists. It influences their writing. So I always get a kick out of that. And so those are, now, following the mystical traditions, some Sephardic Jews and some Hasidic Jews actually have a custom to read the entirety of Shir Shirim as a poem every Friday evening as a renewal of the love between the Jewish people and God. But it's also read on Pesach. Now, why do we read it on Pesach? Any ideas? Well, think about Pesach. We come out of Egypt and we are now establishing a relationship with God. Right?
Remind us of what we are.
Right. We become a people, but we also become a people. It's no longer Abraham's individual relationship with God or Isaac or Jacob. It's now the nation of Israel. And we get to Mount Sinai, which we just celebrate on Shavuot, right? The Revelation. And so at Pesach, firstly, we're beginning this beautiful relationship, this loving relationship between God and the people. And of course, relationships in their beginning stages are very sensual, right? And very physical. And so that's part of the poetry. But it's also poetry that talks about, as I said, wandering through the flowers and the gardens. And Pesach is a time of spring and renewal and rebirth. So that's how the two of them connected. We then get to the book of Ruth, which is traditionally read on Shavuot, which we'll talk about in a second. And this is one of my favorite books to read. In fact, from this class I took with Professor Marcus, unfortunately, I know I took amazing notes, but I only have my notes from the book of Ruth. I don't know what happened to the other Megillot. So I sort of savor all of these lessons. So I don't know if it's big enough for you to see because I use a small font, but can someone read the English? You want to read that for us? And Naomi, go ahead.
Second. Okay. And it came to pass in the days when the judges judged that there was a famine in the land, and a certain man of Bethel in Judah went to sojourn in the field of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons.
All right, so this is a great start for a story, for any story, right? But let's take a look at that. He comes from Bethlehem, and I separated out the words for a reason. Bethlehem in Hebrew is Beit Lechem. And if you think, you all know the word lechem from Hamotzi lechem min haaretz, which means that God brings forth bread from the earth. Lechem is a word for bread. Beit Lechem is the house of bread. So what's ironic here?
Like we get manna. We got
Famine.
There's a famine, right?
There's a famine in the house of bread. There's a famine, right? It's like the shoemaker's children have no shoes, right? There's an irony there that this is where they placed it. Now, for a lot of these stories, there's no real solid evidence that they happened. So we can really assume that the author is thinking about this. And he lives in Judah, which is the southern kingdom, and he goes to Moab. Now, we, the student knows, we're told never to go back to Moab. Why is he going to Moab? Like, we're not supposed to go there. And there's all kinds of other issues with this. His name was Elimelech. Elimelech means my God is king. It's a lovely name. But again, what could that name mean? Well, if God is king, why is he bailing? Why is he leaving the Jewish people? If he's got such an attachment to God as king, right? Why is he bailing? His name is Naomi, which means pleasant. And for the most part, she is a pleasant character. But this is the best part. The name of the two sons are Machlon and Chilion. All right. I don't know if you ever knew twins growing up who had rhyming names. I always felt so bad for those kids, right? Or even people in the same family that have like all the names have to be with the same letter or something. Machlon and Chilion, rhyming names, silly names. And it turns out that I don't remember if I put this. Yeah, I did. That these names mean something. Did I put that here?
No.
Oh, not yet. Okay. They happen to mean. Love this. Machlon means disease, and Chilion means destruction. Who would name their children like that?
Right.
Right? I mean, that's ridiculous. Well, it turns out that that's what's ahead of them. At first, Naomi's husband dies, and she's left there with her two sons in a foreign land, right? But she has her two sons. Don't forget, a woman's status by herself in those days. A woman has no status by herself, right? She has to find either a husband or a father or a brother or an uncle to take her in. So the boys take wives from among the local people. Okay, we're not going to comment on that. Like they're from Judea, they're supposed to marry within their tribe, whatever. And the names of them are Orpah and Ruth. Now, Orpah is a really interesting name because for a few reasons. One, and I don't know if you've heard these stories, I've heard two versions. Oprah Winfrey was named by her mother Orpah from this story. And one story says that she spelled it wrong, or the people in the hospital spelled it wrong, and so it became Oprah. The other story I heard was that people just kept mispronouncing it. And so she became Oprah. I tried to tell this story to a group of teenagers, and my son, who was visiting after I was done, yelled upstairs, said, "How old are those kids?" And I told him, he said, "They have no idea who Oprah is." So, but we know. Now, the other thing which is really interesting is Orpah has to do with the nape of your neck, the back of your neck. Okay, so just keep that in mind. So what happens is after the boys are married, 10 years they're living in Moab, no children, which is a little bit unusual, right? We do have infertility all throughout the Bible, but it is a little unusual that both boys would not father a child within 10 years' time, and both boys die. Right? So this poor woman, Naomi, a pleasant name, this is like really very sad. She has no status in Moab. She has no male in the household, and she opts to go back to Bethlehem where she hears the famine has lifted. And her daughters-in-law opt to go with her. Why? Because in those days when you marry into your husband's family. You leave your father's home and you join your husband's family. So these young women were lovely and devoted to their mother-in-law and said they're going to go with her. And she says, "No, you must go back." They refuse. They go a little bit on the journey. She says again to them, "You must go back." And they say, "No, we're going to stay with you." And then the third time, she says, "You must go back. You're young enough to go and have children. We have no status. We don't know what's awaiting us in Judah. You're not of my people. You're strangers. Who would even take you in Bethlehem?" And Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and goes back home. So hence her name, the back of her neck, because that's what Naomi sees. Ruth, however, does not. And the famous, beautiful lines from the book is when Ruth says to her mother-in-law, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. And this is held up by the rabbis and by teachers. This is the vision of someone choosing to be Jewish and choosing themselves to ally with the Jewish people, that it's not just one of these things, but I will be with you, I will stand with you, I will pray with you, I will die with you. Your people are my people, right? This is a true choice. And what's interesting is that Ruth is the heroine of the story, when actually it was Orpah that listened to her mother-in-law, that did what she was asked to do. Ruth was the rebel in some ways. And also, you'll notice I was careful to let you know, 3 times they were turned away. And I'm sure that many of you are familiar with the custom that when someone seeks to become Jewish, they are to be turned away 3 times. Now, it's done in different ways, and it's done in some eras very harshly and horribly. And there's been all kinds of issues with anti-Semitism and conversion and all kinds of things throughout our long history. But today, most rabbis, when someone comes to a rabbi and says, I'm interested in perhaps becoming Jewish, the rabbis don't overtly turn them away, but they will often say, great, here's a bunch of books, go read the books. And they come back to discuss. Here's another bunch of books, go read the books. And they come back. And the 3rd time, if they're still interested, that's when most rabbis will then engage them in a conversion class of some sort or another. So what happens? They do go back to Bethlehem. A lot of you may be familiar with the story. They have nothing, these 2 women alone. There's a family member that should take them in. There's all kinds of laws about this, but doesn't step up. And so Naomi sends Ruth to glean in the fields of a wealthy farmer. Gleaning, of course, is picking up after the harvest, picking up food for the poor people from the ground. And Ruth goes to glean in the farm of a man named Boaz, which has to do with strength. And through a series of events, some of them a little sketchy, they eventually get married. And the book ends with the fact that they are the great-grandparents of King David. So one of the interesting things about this is, I don't know how much you're familiar with the narrative of Jesus in the New Testament, but Jesus is born where?
Bethlehem?
Bethlehem. Is that where they're from?
No.
No, they're from Nazareth. And they travel to Bethlehem to give birth, which doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And it's usually explained, at least what I've heard it, was that there was some kind of census in the land and everyone had to go back to their ancestral home or something. But Jewish biblical scholars say, no. They had to place Jesus's birth in Bethlehem because he had to be related to King David, because the Messiah will come from the line of King David. And King David comes from Boaz and Ruth. So there's this very interesting line of continuity. So the question is, why do we read it on Shavuot? Not a deep answer, just a simple answer.
With the fields, with harvest, with all that kind of Bethlehem.
That's exactly it. It's the time of the harvest. And on Shavuot, it's the end of the 7 weeks of the barley harvest. And so it's a harvest holiday. Now, it's also the fact that we celebrate receiving the Torah. This came later in our history, but that we sort of renew ourselves again to the covenant with God, just as Ruth took on the covenant of God. So there are some multiple levels, but bottom line is it was a story about the harvest, and it's a harvest holiday. Okay, Eicha, Lamentations. I encourage you, if you have a Bible at home, I don't care if it's King James, JPS, whatever it is, just read it someday. Read it out loud. The language is magnificent, even in the English. Eicha means how. And it's basically, how did this happen to us? God, how have you let this happen? This is written, some people attribute it to Jeremiah. It's written at the time of the destruction of the temple. It is we read it on Tisha B'Av, the 9th of Av, which commemorates the destruction of the temple, and it is a lament or an elegy or a mournful liturgical poem. There happen to be many of these. They're called a kina, or in plural, keynote. I'm not sure if that's where keening comes from. If you know that word of keening, where people wail at a death, it's called keening. And I just think that there must be some connection to keynote. The keynote are read leading up to Tisha B'Av for 9 days. Not that you and I necessarily do it, but people do. There are at least 50 keynote that are specifically for Tisha B'Av. They're numbered and referred to by number. Many of them are very, very old, most about 1,000 years old, if not older. Very, very difficult Hebrew, and they're said during the day of Tisha B'Av. Most of us just know Echa from the Bible. We read it in its entirety the evening before, at sundown, and then it's also read the next morning. It is just the saddest poem, but beautiful. The tradition used to be you sit on the floor like you would in a house of mourning. You light candles, makes it very hard to see the text, but you light candles like a house of mourning. And the tune is very soulful and mournful, and it's 5 chapters long. The middle chapter has a slightly separate tune that just a custom most people do, but it is just a magnificent, magnificent piece of poetry. 5 chapters, describes, as you can see, the city, the country, the palace, the temple. It's all destroyed. It's all gone. How could this happen? And then the poem's broken down. You can see the different pieces of each poem. Poem 3, which is the one that has a slightly different tune, is the voice of a person who's experiencing leaving, being deported out of Jerusalem, and the degradation that they faced from the destruction. And the last one is sounds like a prayer, and we'll see the last line ends with an appeal to God: return us, hashkivenu, which is a line that we say every time we put the Torah away in the synagogue. Again, it's attributed to Jeremiah because there are places in the Bible that says Jeremiah lamented for the people, or the people were mourning and Jeremiah lamented. But again, we don't know. Probably it had multiple authors because there are multiple styles. Interestingly enough, chapters 1, 2, and 4 are in Aleph Bet order, and each has their 22 letters, 22 verses. Chapter 3 is also in that order, but there are 3 verses for each letter. I don't know if any of you know Washington, D.C. very well, but Washington, D.C. has street names that are in alphabetical order. And after they go through the whole alphabet once, then there's 2 streets for every letter, and then there's 3 streets for every letter. So this is a motif that's used for all kinds of reasons. Chapter 5 is not in Aleph Bet order, but it is 22 verses. So was it added later? We don't know. And of course, this is a relief of the menorah being carried out of, and the riches of the temple being carried out of Jerusalem. So why Aleph Bet order? What does that do for us? Anyone know why Aleph Bet order?
Puts it in order? Well, yeah.
Right, it helps them keep it in order, it helps them remember. Don't forget, not everyone had written documents, so it helps you remember the order. It's harder to lose lines when things are in alphabetical order. It's like somebody will say, wait, where's the Gimel line? What was the Gimel line? I don't want to forget it, right? But also there's a little bit of the A to Z kind of thing, that it's complete, right? Something in Aleph Bet order includes everything. So it can be thought of as an appeal to God, but God is silent. We don't hear God's voice, right? We hear God's voice in the prophets. We don't hear God's voice here. And I love this portion right here in the middle. It doesn't create a new theology because they're horribly depressed. Everything is horrible. Everyone hates them. Everything is destroyed. They don't let go of the essence of who they are. They accept, in their opinion, that the sin of disloyalty to God, the idolatry that was experienced, the baseless hatred between people, this will lead to destruction and exile at the hand of God. Now, that's a little bit of a tough relationship, because you take that and the line will bring you, in my opinion, can bring you to our time, and were Jews responsible for the Holocaust? Was it because we weren't religious enough or following God's laws that the Holocaust happened? And I have a hard time accepting that. So I have a hard time accepting this. But I'm happier for the people 2,000 years ago to believe it than I am for people today. So they really believe that the Babylonians were not the people that conquered them. It was God helping the Babylonians to conquer them. They never lost sight of the divine relationship. And repentance is what's needed. It's mentioned, but it's not central. It's mostly that we deserve our punishment and now we'll move on. So it's a very interesting approach to life. Again, fine for 2,000 years ago. I don't think so fine for today. Now, there is a relationship between the word echa and the word ayeka. You can see that it's the same letters, Aleph, Yud, Kaf, Hey. Right? Don't forget, in the Torah, there's no vowels, no dots. So they would look exactly the same. The word ayeka means, where are you? And we see it right in the beginning of Breshit, when God is calling to Adam and says, ayeka, where are you? And now here we have echa, how could you let this happen? Or is it us saying to God, ayeka, where are you? Right? So it's a very nice relationship at our depth. Echa, how could this happen? But also ayeka, where are you? And what do we have to do to rekindle that relationship? And then I just wanted to read this with you because it's beautiful. Again, is the print big enough for anyone to read the English? Yeah, Diane, you want to give a read from the beginning?
Sure. Am I on?
Yeah.
Okay. The old men are gone from the gate, the young men from their music. Gone is the joy of our hearts. Our dancing is turned into mourning. The crown has fallen from our head. Woe to us that we have sinned. Because of this, our hearts are sick. Because of these, our eyes are dimmed. Because of Mount Zion, which lies desolate, jackals prowl over it. But you, O Lord, are enthroned forever. Your throne endures through the ages. Why have you forgotten us utterly, forsaken us for all time? Take us back, O Lord, to yourself, and let us come back. Renew our days as of old, for truly you have rejected us, bitterly raged against us.
Now these are the last lines, but in fact, when you read Echa, you don't end with this line. You repeat line 21, because Judaism has a very strong culture that we don't end on a depressing note. We have to always end with hope. And so this line, Hashivenu Adonai Elecha v'nashuva chadesh yameinu kekedem, which we sing as part of the, when you put the Torah back in the ark, we sing, Eitz chaim hi, l'machazikim ba. The last line is, Hashivenu, is this line, take us back, renew our days as of old. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that we're saying, oh, we want the good old days. It means we want to get back to the right place, right? It means we want to get back to balance. We want to get back to a safe place. Diane, please.
Do you, it's just because we've been reading this, we're on with God, we're off with God, we're on. I keep thinking that when we fall short, that is when God kind of like sticks us and says, you're falling short, get back on track. So all of these things keep happening because we're human and we do fall short. And it's his way of saying, I'm with you, but you still have work to do. You still have to get back on track again.
Absolutely. And it's, look, it's part of the human condition, whether or not you have a strong God concept or not, it is part of the human condition. And in Judaism, we've got built-in corrections, right? Every Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, take stock of yourself, right? And get back to the way you want to be. But at all of our seasons, we have something that reminds us, stop, take stock, make sure you're in the right direction, because we need it, because we're human, right? The human condition is not a perfect state. And which came first? I don't know. Did God design this? Did humans react with this? I don't know, but it's there, and I find it very powerful and very forgiving. We've done a little bit of study and work with folks, like, what is repentance? and specifically with folks that are coming out of prisons and jails, not even mentioning those that were wrongly accused and found guilty incorrectly. But how does a person come out of that and restart their lives? Because society doesn't make it easy for them. But as Jews, like we came up once because I don't know, somebody was concerned that one of our employees had a record, and we had this whole huge discussion. And I said, as Jews, we're taught they have to be able to restart. That's what we say all the time, right? So I find it very powerful. Okay. Okay, all right. So then we get on to Kohelet. And I know I keep saying they're all my favorite, but this is really my favorite. I studied it when I was a teenager at summer camp, and it just changed my life. It's called Ecclesiastes in English, which has to do with a congregation, a church group, whatever. But it's but Kohelet also, Kahal, Kehillah, is a community, it's a congregation. But Kohelet we're taught with someone's name, so they sort of have similar meanings. And this was written by a guy named Schlesinger. I found it on My Jewish Learning. People hate the book of Kohelet. It's seen as a depressing, horrible, awful book. Death is a problem for all of us. The closer we get to it, for many of us, the more difficult it is to wrestle with. If it's all temporary, if life is temporary, what's the point, right? It's a point of depression for many people. And this is what Kohelet talks about, that nothing matters. It's all vain and futile. There's nothing new under the sun. Do whatever you want because we're all going to wind up in the ground anyway. And so what a horrible message. And it seems that it's so pessimistic, or is it? And I was very fortunate that I thought, a wonderful, wonderful teacher who painted it in a very different life. The first words of the book do say, these are the words of Kohelet, the son of King David in Jerusalem. Now, the son of King David is King Solomon, right? So this is why they attribute it to Solomon, but we don't know that that's at all true. Until modern times, that was the truth, but nobody thinks that. No scholars think that today. And when you look at all the literary things, it's clearly not King Solomon. If it's depressing, why is it in the Tanakh? Well, of course, it almost wasn't. Again, this is one of the books that they argued over. And here's some of the reasons for keeping it out. The name of God, those 4 letters of God's name, the tetragrammaton, not used at all, not mentioned. Now, we also know that God's not mentioned in the book of Esther, which will come later, but not mentioned here either. Lots of contradictions in the book. For every, just like we saw in Proverbs, for every sort of negative thing, there's sort of a positive thing. And there are blatant contradictions as well. It was considered heretical because a lot of basic ideas were absent. No talk about the soul. Now, this is, again, around 2,000 years ago, the rabbis are putting together the canon, and they are very steep, just like the early Christians, in the idea of life after death and all of those issues. And this book doesn't have any of it. No life after death, no reward or punishment after death, no need to observe the teachings of the Torah. That's nowhere in the book. And it seems to say that God is not involved in our affairs. Now, we might say that today as modern thinkers, that there's a theory about God, what's it called, the watchmaker or clockworks, that God set it all in motion and then God went away, right? And now it's up to us, right? But that was very unusual then. God was very much seen as active in those years. Robert Gordis, who is a scholar, rabbi and scholar in the middle part of the last century, there's scarcely one aspect of all of the verses in the book that has not been the subject of wide difference of opinion. Everything in this book has been argued over, and yet it was very popular. And 122 of the 222 verses, so a little bit more than half, are quoted in the Talmud and Midrashic sources, either in whole or in part. That's a little unusual. This clearly had a huge effect on the rabbis, even as they argued against it. So how can it be seen as anything other than depressing? Well, oh wait, I'm in the wrong place. I'm sorry, I jumped ahead. A summary of the book, that it's a discussion of the meaning of life and the best way to live. All of our actions are hevel, vain, futile. There's no point to it. The line here is havel havelim Amar Kohelet, Havel Havelim. Everything is futile. There's no point to anything, right? Whether you're rich or poor, whether you're foolish or wise, you're all, life's going to end the same for all of us. But clearly wisdom does come forward as the means for a well-lived life. If all of it is vain, if all of it is futile, and in the line "Eat, drink, and be merry" is from Kohelet, then how do you live a good life, right? You don't want to be depressed your whole life. Well, he endorses wisdom. That's part of wisdom literature, and to me, that's very powerful. And that one should enjoy the simple pleasures. You know, we talk about today counting our blessings. We talk about developing a practice of appreciation. Our very ancient morning blessings that we say every day from the Siddur or every Shabbat, our gratitude, starting with Modeh Ani when I wake up, to the blessings of the morning, that it's built into Judaism to just be happy. A beautiful, beautiful quote from Pirkei Avot is, "Who is rich, Ezehu Ashir, the one who is happy with their lot." Now, that doesn't mean you should accept bad times, but it means don't keep chasing the elusive golden ring at the end of life. It's not there. Find happiness now, in the here and now. I think it was Skinner that wrote a book. Was it Skinner or Huxley? The line was, "Here and now, boys. Focus on now." That's what life is about. I really love this book. And there's a conclusion, though, even though God's not mentioned, but it's teased out there, that you have to have fear of what you don't understand, that there are basic rules of society that need to be kept, and that it's the duty of everyone to live together and do this, if only like the world would listen. So how can it be seen as other than depressing? Well, embrace it, right? Life is short. You know, eat dessert, what is it? Life is short, eat dessert, first or something. So, find ways to find joy, right? And it's hard. And it's really hard when, God forbid, you're sick, or that there's tragic death, or even not tragic death, and the pandemic, and the economy, and people hating Jews, and all of the horrible things in the world, and disease, what's happening in India, and what's happening in Myanmar, and girls being taken seemingly daily in Nigeria, and all these horrible things we don't even hear about. You still have to find joy, because otherwise you may as well just crawl under a rock and just end it now. Like we don't have any choice, right? So choose life. You have to find the value of the present. So hard to do, but it's such a good watchword. I think that's why a lot of people take up meditation and yoga practice, because it helps them frame some of these. What my rabbi would always say is, look, just pray 3 times a day. You'll get the same, the same result. But of course, very few of us have a relationship to prayer. Wisdom is meaningful, and wealth. You can enjoy it today. It's, especially at our ages, it's a little hard. Like, the money's there. Do I spend it now? What if there's not enough for later? It's a very difficult issue, but we're not supposed to spend our lives waiting for the what if. We're supposed to live our lives. And I find it, to me, very, very, very helpful, this book. In fact, I also loved, you may remember the play You Can't Take It With You, which has a similar motif, right? And also, there's a line attributed to the Malcolm Forbes, a very flamboyant millionaire. He who dies with the most toys wins. Well, that's not how I want to live, right? It's not true. He who dies with the most toys is still dead, right? It doesn't change anything. We do see it amongst the very wealthy that leave in their will, they leave money to charitable organizations and foundations, that they understand that I didn't build this for nothing. Let it at least do some good after I'm gone. And of course, from Kohelet, we also have, this is one of the most famous lines, Ve'ein kol chadash tachat hashemesh, there's nothing new under the sun. However you want to say it, what goes around comes around. There's a French phrase, my mother used to say it, plus le même chose, something. It's nothing changes, right? It just keeps going. There are wars, there's peace, babies are born, people die. Yeah, Diane.
I was just thinking, as you're reading this is a great book for now, because it must have been written at a time that's very similar to now, where everything seems upside down. And the good that you think is there is not as there as you think it is. But that if you let yourself go down that rabbit hole, you have to find, I mean, like I've been trying to drive around lately and say, oh my God, look at that tree. Isn't that tree gorgeous? Look at that flower. We just have a gardenia bush out there. Look at those gardenias. You know what I mean? Just because there is beauty, but it gets so mulled over by all the bad things that are going on.
Right. The whole
kind of like
exactly, all those little catchphrases, take time to smell the roses, right? All those little catchphrases, they all come from the same place, and they all have real value, I believe. Living a mindful life, all of these issues. And you're right. The times, these times are probably what gives rise to the need for this kind of a text.
And I feel whoever wrote this was saying, okay, it may be bad, and you may not believe that you got a soul, and you may not believe there's a hereafter, but there's a here. So take advantage of the here. That
exactly.
Is available.
Exactly. And what you're probably most familiar with is the song Turn, 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 written originally by the Weavers, and then in my day put out by the Birds. And they added a line, which is not in the text, time for love, a time for hate, a time for peace, which is how the text ends. And they added, I swear it's not too late. And that's added in the song that's not in the original text. But it's this balance of everything. And you can go through these with a Bible scholar, and they will just explain this amazing balance of life and why these examples were chosen. So why do we read it on Sukkot?
It's the beginning of things.
Okay, beginning of what? What time of year is it in Sukkot in Israel? What happens?
It's the harvest and planting.
But it's over. Everything's dead, right?
Everything is fresh, new, seedlings coming up.
Not in Sukkot.
No.
At Sukkot, it's the end. At Pesach, it's the beginning, right? So Sukkot, think about it. For us, it's even easier than in Israel. For us, we go into the winter months. If you've ever lived up north, everything turns brown. The leaves are all gone. Will the flowers come back? Right? And this book says, yes, embrace the winter and it'll come back, right? In Israel, it's the beginning of the rainy season. There's flooding, but no, not growing in the winter. Sort of, it's a little confusing in Israel, but it's a season change, and everything is now dormant until the almond tree in Israel begins to grow in January. And going into that, you need a little bit of Kohelet. Okay, now we get to the one we all know, Esther. Of course, Esther's on a scroll that we often seen and often beautifully, beautifully designed. We're not going to go much into the story of Esther, because I know that that's the one that you will be most familiar with. But some issues. What are some of the unusual things in Esther? Well, it's again secular, like Kohelet a little bit. No mention of God. We know God's name is not in the book. The temple's not mentioned, the commandments are not mentioned, and it takes place outside the land. It's the only book that takes place outside the land. And there were many, many arguments about including this book. There's many people that feel that they were celebrating anyway that time of year. If you think of it, it's also Mardi Gras time of year. Lots of ancient festivals around that, whatever it is, the spring equinox, whatever it's called. Lots of legends and old idolatrous celebrations. And this became the Jewish one. Mordecai literally writes a letter to the rabbis in Israel and says, you need to declare a holiday for the Jews all over the world because we Jews in Persia survived. And the rabbis at first don't buy it, but ultimately they do agree. And then there's the issue of Bible codes. I don't know how many of you saw the Da Vinci Code, but Bible codes are real. Numerology is real. People are really into this. And they look in the text for hidden messages, okay? And some of them are a little bit eerie that they actually seem to be there. So for example, is God in the Megillah? Well, look at this verse, right? It has nothing to do with God, but here you see Yud, Hey, Vav, Hey. There's God's name. Somebody spent all this time finding those 4 letters, right, in sequence. They'll say this, God's name is there. And there are many, many other examples of this. That's the easiest one. There's another one that I really love, that the rabbi said that it's possible that we always say it's called Purim because of the lots that were cast, but look what's hidden in the name. Pesach, Sukkot and Sukkot, that's the U for Purim. Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippurim, Matan Torah, which is Shavuot, the giving of the Torah. So now you've got the 3 harvest holidays and the 2 Tishrei holidays. These are the holidays mentioned in the Bible. They're all contained in Purim. Purim is clearly an important holiday. It contains all of the others. All right. There's also a beautiful piece that I couldn't find, because on Yom Kippur, we say Yom Kippurim sometimes. Yom, a day, Ki, like Purim, right? Instead of a day of atonements, it's a day like Purim. And they talk about these things that on Yom Kippur, you're completely exposed before God. On Purim, you're masked. On Yom Kippur, you don't eat anything. On Purim, you feast. Right, and there are all these kinds of interesting balances between the two holidays. And then, of course, Esther. There are all kinds of things with the name of Esther, but one is that it's related to the word nistar, which means hidden, and the word Megillah could be related to the word Magella, which means to reveal. Thus, the Megillah of Esther can literally be the revelation of the hidden, which is a really nice way of looking at it. I'll share with you the bottom line is the book of Esther is way more than what we teach to kids. And if you ever have an opportunity, if Rabbi Bender or others give a lesson on it, you should absolutely avail yourselves of it. There's so much in this story that's not for kids, good and bad. I mean, it ends very violently. I was very surprised at the Megillah reading that we did with B'nai Israel. Diane, I think you read aloud chapter 9 in English. That's like the worst chapter to read in English. It's
Not that right. I asked Rabbi Bender, what did I do wrong?
Really, like when I saw it, I said, that's what they chose to read in English? Like, don't read that one in English. It's again, we hide it from people that there was all this death at the hands of Jews, that we killed others. But it's a fabulous holiday. Yeah.
Other thing that's, I just realized, because you were saying that it's odd, that they didn't know Esther was Jewish. When has that ever happened in history, that the Jews have in some way been marked so that the people they're amongst knows that they're Jews?
Right. It's an interesting issue. It's an interesting issue, right? We've always been seen as other. How were they not seen as other?
Exactly.
Yeah, totally. So those are the 5 Megillot, each one for a different. Oh, and finally, I'm sorry, we have this notion, Arur Haman, cursed be Haman, and Levarach Mordechai, blessed be Mordechai, and they have equal gematria. Like if you take the numerical values of the words, they're exactly equal. 2 sides of the same coin. Lots of interesting articles lately about looking at Mordechai as not such a hero. So a lot of interesting pieces in the book of Esther. But of course it's Purim, so we have fun and we don't always pay such attention. All right, well, next week, we're going to just cram in all the rest of all of these books. Daniel is very mystical. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, but there are a few famous scenes from Daniel I want to touch on. Job is probably, we could spend a whole semester on Job. It's an astounding book and story and philosophy that I do want to give you a nod to, that you'll know what's in there. Ezra and Nehemiah are the prophets that come back to the land of Israel to build the second temple. And there's some pretty surprising things in those books also. And then the books of Chronicles, which we'll spend very little time on, basically are a recap of everything else that's gone on. But the interesting thing with the books of Chronicles is it seems that they were put there to put a positive spin on King David. They didn't want to leave us with the stories of King David that are in the books of the Kings, because David doesn't come out so great there, right? When he's killing off women's husbands and having trouble with his own sons and whatnot. And they have a vested interest in making the legacy of King David to be very positive. And so the book of Chronicles is definitely, like, you can see the political spin masters at work as they rewrite some of those passages. So we'll do that next week, and then it comes to an end. I don't know if y'all are going to be studying all summer. I'm going to be doing some work with the Roanoke Jewish community over the summer, and I'll be teaching there. They have an adult ed group that meets on Wednesday afternoons. If anyone's interested, you're also more than welcome to join, but I know you guys have blocked out Thursday nights. And Rabbi Bender will be back, which will be fantastic. So I will see you all next week, unless you have questions.
No, thank you very much.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome very much.
As usual.
You're a challenge.
That's good, though.
Of
Challenges.
course. Yeah, challenge is good. It makes you
All right.
think.
Good night, all.
Good night.
night.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye, Anita.
Bye. Hope to see you.
We need to talk about the, whatchamacallits.
Planning. We're going to
Yeah.
meet every other week now.
Okay, I'll give you a ring.
Okay.
Bye-bye.